So we're going to have a sort of special treat before we actually begin the debate. Back when I was in the 8th grade, my nun gave me a book called U.S. History Can Be Fun. And it was a series of, about 30 stories, little anecdotes of things that had, I think, legitimately happened in American history. I don't think they were all apocryphal. And I really loved it. It really fired up my imagination. And the person I'm going to bring to the stage now is the embodiment at a much higher level, much more sophisticated level of the idea that U.S. history can be fun because of the things she's written about, the influence she's had on a particular Broadway show, which we'll talk about, and the things that she can bring as insight to the conversation that we're going to have now. So please welcome to the stage Joanne Freeman. Hi, Joanne.
Hi.
Why don't you grab a seat? And just a little bit to tell people who you are. Right now, you're a professor of history at Yale, and you have written a bunch of books that look at history. Your approach is very serious, but the upshot is really fun, I have to say. And I want to start with the connection you have to the Broadway show Hamilton, which is a little bit accidental as far as you know, but it's there, it's for real.
It is, and I didn't really know about it till I went to see the show. And I was in the audience, and I'm a political historian, and I write about political violence, so I've written a lot about dueling. And I was in the audience, and there's a dueling song in the musical, and I was very happy in the audience. There's a dueling song, and then it became a rules of dueling song, and I was really happy. It's a rules of dueling song. And then a lyric came out that was from my book. And I was with a friend, and I said, "That's my document." So in the audience, I discovered. Then I met Lin-Manuel Miranda, and indeed, he had read my book. So that was a surprise.
So he fessed up immediately.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
What was the lyric?
It's about the doctor turning his back so he has deniability.
And it was borrowed.
Well,
verbatim.
The fact of it was from a document I found on the bottom of a box at the New York Historical Society.
Okay, so you have, when I said that your approach to history reveals really interesting, fun stuff, I mean, you get to a very granular level of interactions between members of Congress prior to the Civil War, a time which is it's very hard to really know what was going on the floors of Congress. But you've discovered that some really, really radically violent stuff has been happening on the floor of Congress. Beyond, there's the famous incident, which I'm sure you'll start with, but there's much more than that.
There's a lot more than that, yeah. And I am interested in politics and the humor of it, but not just because it's humorous, but because what I'm really, really interested in is the humanity of it, the people, the fact that it's people engaged in politics and not just ideas battling each other in some way. So sometimes there's humor when you're talking about people engaged in politics. So I've written a book about physical violence in the U.S. Congress between the 1820s and the Civil War. And everyone knows probably the most famous incident, even if you don't know the name of it, and that's the caning of abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate. So that's the famous one, and I think
to within inches of his life. It was
he was out of commission for 2 years, I think, afterwards. So it was a caning sounds sort of tame, and it isn't.
Can you back up and what happened at that incident?
Sure. He gave a really rousing anti-slavery speech in which he insulted in some ways the South and South Carolina and some particular senators. And a kinsman of one of those insulted senators decided that he needed to redeem the name of his family and his state and of the South. So he waited until the Senate became mostly empty. Sumner was at his desk. They weren't in session. He was actually franking copies of his speech to send out. And this other fellow from South Carolina, Preston Brooks, walked in and announced that he was redeeming the name of the South and his family and just began to violently cane him. And the desks were bolted to the floor. So Sumner had a very hard time getting up, and he ultimately wrenched the desk out of the floor in his attempt to get away from Preston Brooks.
So that's the famous one. And
that's the famous one.
Turns out there are like 70 others.
Yes, there are about, as a matter of fact, that's the number. There's about 70 others.
There's a lot.
Yes, yes.
So tell us, first of all, how did you find this?
Well, I knew I wanted to write about the culture of politics in this time period. And all I knew going into the project was that in 1838, one congressman killed another congressman in a duel. So my thought was, okay, well, 1838's got to be a good starting point if you're looking at violence in Congress. And as luck would have it, the collection I was looking at, this congressman wrote to his wife every day. And I began seeing in these daily letters to his wife, so-and-so pushing up his sleeves to throw a punch, so-and-so caning thus and such. And I kept thinking, I kept recording it, and I kept thinking, why don't I know about all of these things? I mean, I know in a general way there was violence, but there's a lot of violence. Is this guy entertaining his wife? Or is there something going on here? So I began researching in the diaries, private papers, letters to wives ended up being one of my most useful resources, because congressmen confessed all of their fears to their wives, which is not surprising.
So these were letters to wives in which the congressmen were upset that there was violence, or were they kind of bragging about?
No, they were scared.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a North Carolina congressman who kind of jokingly says to his wife, maybe only big guys should get elected to Congress, because I don't know how I feel in this room.
So what was going on?
Well, the short answer to that question is Southerners in this time period were pretty comfortable with dueling and dueling culture. I mean, Southern society was slavery-bound society, and it's more violent. Northerners were good at rioting, but they really weren't focused on dueling. So Southerners had an advantage, and they knew that if they stood up and threatened or intimidated someone who opposed slavery, who was a Northerner, that person would not want to tangle with a Southerner and would either not stand up in the first place or would back down. And so Southerners were using that advantage to silence anybody who opposed slavery.
Did it have that impact? Did it actually affect policy and legislation?
Yeah, oh no, for sure it did. I mean, there are
So the threat of
instances-
violence on the Hall of Congress among representatives sent by their people to Washington, the threat of violence had a lot to do with the lack of progress on
Yeah. People resigned from committees because they were intimidated. There's one diary from an Ohio congressman where he talks about people not being willing to stand up to someone because he's a Southerner and you just don't do that. So it certainly did have an impact.
I mean, you would think a thing like that could lead to civil war.
You'd think, huh?
Yeah. So, and any other colorful details about just how violent did it got? Did it anything else to come up as close as the caning of Sumner?
Well, they were armed, right? So they had Bowie knives, they had pistols, there were fist fights, they flipped over desks. There's a big fight in 1858 in which a Northerner says something opposed to slavery. A Southerner says, "Don't you say that here." And the Northerner says, he's a kind of a feisty one, says something like, "I can say anything I want. It's a free house, and I'm not going to listen to any damn slaveholder." Thank you very much. I needed the sound effect, the ooh.
Yeah.
And so this Southerner walked up to him to throw a punch, and this other congressman beat him to it and slugged him, and the Southerner fell flat. And at this point, all the Southerners in the House began rushing to that point.
It's like a basketball game.
I will take your
Yeah.
word for that.
Yeah.
I don't know. And then all of
Everybody's
the
off the
Northerners.
bench, yeah.
Everyone came off the bench, yes, or maybe that's hockey. I don't know. Whichever one it is.
You're right. I don't know what
Everybody,
sports
yeah. I'm not a sports person.
Me neither. I shouldn't have.
But
even tried.
they all ran at each other. They all basically engaged in a huge brawl in the space in front of the Speaker's platform in the House of Representatives, throwing spittoons, punching each other,
Wow.
And it ended when one congressman grabbed someone's hair to throw a punch and his toupee came off. Which shows you that slapstick is eternal, because then everyone started laughing and it stopped.
I think we all think, going back maybe 30, 40 years earlier to the founders, we're used to seeing them all sort of, in the painting standing like this, and they're gesturing like this, and they're standing in rows. For some reason, I guess in the old days, legislators wore wigs and stood in rows. And but there's this sense that there's a nobility and a sort of heightened sense of decency about these guys. And you were saying to me before, that's kind of a fantasy. They could be pretty venal.
Yeah. I mean, well, this gets back to where you started us, right? I mean, what we're looking at people, and even though they're capital F founders, the fact of the matter is they're people. And they sometimes came up with admirable ideas, and sometimes they were just people who were ticked off with each other and behaving badly or behaving selfishly. There is no period in American history that's sort of the golden, beautiful moment when there hasn't been some kind of political banging going on.
So I want to talk a little bit leap from that to the formation of political parties. You could take us back to what the founders were thinking about political parties. And you and I have talked ahead of time that you're not going to say anything that will influence the audience's vote on the resolution before us, but you're just going to tell us what happened at the beginning.
Yeah.
So we all know that at the beginning, George Washington did not have a political party, and when he left office, he said, by the way, let's not have political parties, it's a terrible idea. Was that a common thought among the founding fathers?
Yeah, I mean, part of the background here is, it was so difficult to pull these states, which were kind of almost nation states when they were colonies, so hard to pull them together that the founders certainly never thought that they'd all somehow unite and that there would be any national anything that was capable of bringing together people throughout the nation. So they assumed there'd be factions, they assumed there'd be partisan fighting, but they did not assume that there were going to be organized parties of any kind.
And did they fear that?
Yes, as a matter of fact,
Why?
they did. They assumed that an organized party is a group of people who are out to promote themselves and no one else. Thank you for that sound effect too. Yeah, no, not true. But that was their assumption, and so in the 1790s,
Was that intuition or was that experience from England or?
That was more than experience, but that was sort of the assumption about political parties. Why else would you want to organize? I mean, the republic, in creating a republic and not a monarchy, part of the logic of that was, well, it's grounded on the people and it's grounded on their will. So that's going to be the driving force, rather than sort of top-down organization.
So how soon did we get political parties?
Well, the first real parties, when organized with mascots and banners and everything else, that's Andrew Jackson. So you get early on Federalists and Republicans, Hamilton and Washington, Jefferson and Madison banging at each other, but no one's really happy about calling themselves a party. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, Jefferson at one point says, Hamilton dares to call us a party. So they're trying to stay away from that because that means they're not thinking of the public good, but only of themselves.
So do you have an explanation for why, given this impulse and this concern about the existence of parties formed anyway? Is it human nature?
Well, it's partly has to do with the United States, which was so spread out, and people were so spread out over a large geographic area that when parties started to organize, part of what they found was, wow, this is really effective, right? It's a national network. You can spread the fibers of the network all throughout the nation. It's somehow people become more coordinated. And then there's something about a party. People at the time said this. There's a sort of narrator in my book, actually, you can see him experiencing this. There's like a team dynamic which didn't exist without parties. And this one fellow I write about, you could feel him. He's just swept into Jackson's party, who really does bring about the first real organized party. There's something for the people who are in it. And then strategically, sort of pragmatically, it's really useful for getting things done and getting a message out.
And Jackson's party was the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. Our current Democratic Party, ultimately, that's its lineage.
Well, so here, people love to draw the straight line back.
You can't do it, huh?
There are no straight lines in American politics, no. Because names start and stop and, strategies shift, and this is the party of whatever, and then suddenly this becomes the party of whatever. Certainly, the Republican Party that begins in the mid-1850s and the Jacksonian Democrats or Democratic Party that begins in that era percolate forward, but you can't say that what they are today is a direct line back to what they were then.
We all miss the Whigs.
The poor Whigs, yes.
Yeah. How many elections did they do well in?
Well, they kind of coalesced as a party against Jackson.
Yeah.
They didn't have a lot in common, but they all hated Andrew Jackson. That was what they shared.
But parties have come and gone, and that has not been the case really, at least in name, for a very long time now. There is a sort of, apparently, a stability to where we are now, would you say? Yeah,
and the parties, the early part of the 19th century parties, there were a lot of parties that came and went rather quickly, and none of them stuck around. Mm-hmm. So it also could be over time, as people got used to this way of conducting politics, the stability of it sort of kicked in. You had the Liberty Party and the American Party and, the anti-Mason Party, and you probably haven't heard of some of them, and there's a reason they didn't survive very long.
Were they national?
Yeah. effectively so, I don't know, but they were striving to be national parties, yeah.
I want to get back briefly to dueling. How did dueling go away? Since you've made it clear that it was really a thing. How did it stop, and might it make a comeback?
Okay, I'll start with the second half first.
Yeah.
I really hope not.
Yeah.
It partly went away because it became really a Southern thing. For a while, Northerners and Southerners were engaging in it. It becomes something that Southerners are proud of. It's sort of Southern culture, and it's something, part of the specialness of the South. It begins to fade away. No one really wants to duel. It was an effective tool of proving yourself as a leader. Over time, it begins to fade away. And there's a little splurge of it after the Civil War, but I think it was no longer accomplishing what it had been accomplishing before for leaders.
You have a podcast.
I do.
What's the theme of the podcast?
The podcast is Backstory, and it's an American history podcast, and the title tells you just what it does. It looks at something current, and we go back and find the backstory. Look at how the past, what was the history of it? How did this play out in another time period? And it's 4 historians. There's 2 20th century historians and a 19th century historian and me. And so part of it is interviewing people and trying to reconstruct the backstory, and part of it is us just talking to each other, and we love working together. And it's that part is not scripted. So part of it is just the fun of historians talking to each other and learning from each other.
And just very briefly, when did you start getting interested in history, and how did this era in American history capture your attention?
The short answer?
Yeah.
The bicentennial.
Oh.
And this period was everywhere. The founding was everywhere, and everywhere. Every commercial, bicentennial minutes, every newspaper. And I began reading biographies of founders because they were everywhere, and I wanted to know who they were. And I actually got up to Hamilton and stopped because he was such a quirky character.
Yeah.
But that's what drew me in. And then trying to figure out Hamilton, then I became interested in dueling, and then I became interested in political violence, and then I just became interested in politics. And that's kind of how I got into what I'm doing now.
Can you remind us all the name of your most recent book?
It's called The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War.
And you found that phrase, field of blood, in your research?
The phrase comes from a letter written to Charles Sumner. And this friend of Sumner's, after the caning, says, essentially, I knew that something would happen on that field of blood, the floor of Congress. So thank you again. You guys are excellent at the sound effects. That was kind of Hosanna quote for a historian. It was like, oh my gosh, not only is the violence not surprising, he expected it. So that was a...
And I've got a title for my book.
And I got a title for my book, yes.
Well, as I said at the beginning, my 8th grade nun told me that U.S. history can be fun, and you've just proven it. So, Joanne Freeman, I want to thank you so much for coming by.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure.